Hello, everyone. My name is Joy Riggs. I'm the author of Crackerjack Bands and Hometown Boosters, Story of a Minnesota Music Band. Today is my book's official 1 year birthday, and to kick off the celebration, which is going to include cake tonight, but unfortunately I don't have enough to share. So my gift to you is I'm going to read an excerpt from the book. The section I'm going to read is from chapter 15, which is called Widows and Ghosts, and it takes place in June of 2010, which is 10 years ago now, kind of hard to believe. So here we go, Widows and Ghosts. Steve had suggested several years earlier that I take a trip every time he did a show, as compensation for my evenings and weekends as a temporary single parent. I appreciated the idea, but it seemed impractical, financially and logistically, especially once he started doing several shows a year. I had wanted to visit Crookston, though, so I invited my parents to go with me. Dad and I hadn't included Mom in our previous trips, and I was afraid she felt left out, even though delving into her husband's family history appealed to her about as much as undergoing a colonoscopy. To make this trip worth her while, I told her Crookston had a candy shop known for its chippers, potato chips made from locally grown potatoes, covered in chocolate. Yes, I bribed my mom with chocolate. She was in. The last time I had traveled the stretch of interstate between Alexandria and Fargo with my parents, my brother Pete was a senior at Concordia College in Moorhead, and I was a senior in high school. Pete got us all tickets for the college's Christmas Choral Festival, not because he was a fan of choral music, he wasn't, but because he figured my parents would appreciate it. It was my first experience attending a traditional Lutheran college choral concert. I didn't learn until years later that the tradition was established at St. Olaf College in 1912 by an acquaintance of G. Oliver's, F. Milius Christiansen. Snippets of the concert remain lodged in my brain, the narrator's deep voice, the 300-plus choral singers wearing robes, but mostly I remembered the bitter wind that whipped across the flat campus. The trip may have subconsciously reaffirmed my decision to head south for college in the fall instead of north. This time, my parents and I went farther north, and the land became flatter and flatter as we approached the Canadian border. This was the Red River Valley, known for potatoes, sugar beets, and occasionally for flooding. We planned to visit both Crookston and Grand Forks, which were separated by a state border, a river, and a distance of about 25 miles. Crookston's downtown was larger than I had expected for a town of 8,000 people. We picked up a walking tour brochure at the Convention and Visitors Bureau, located in the two-story historic Morris building, designed by Gialver and Eileen's friend, Bert Keck. After lunch at a Chinese restaurant, we ventured next door to Widman's, the chocolate shop, for dessert. It was a delightful step back in time. The long glass counter along one wall displayed a variety of tempting treats, including an assortment of chippers, milk chocolate, white chocolate, dark chocolate. But the real treat was meeting owner George Widman. His grandfather, also named George Widman, opened the store at its present location in 1911. The younger George reminded me of Tim Conway, an actor I grew up watching on the Carol Burnett show. He had a deadpan, earnest way of speaking, but unlike Tim, George was not trying to get a laugh. I showed him a copy of a Crookston band program from 1908 that listed Widman's as a sponsor. He told us about how the family business later expanded to Fargo and Grand Forks, and he explained how he made the candy there in the store. We sampled the chippers and bought a variety box to enjoy later. Another stop on our tour was the Polk County Historical Museum, where my eyes were drawn to a panoramic photo hanging on one wall. It was an old photo of a boys' band taken on the steps of a building. Gelver stood toward the back with his sons on either side of him. All the boys had numbers printed next to their faces. Here's the picture. Whoa! Also, you'll notice it's on the front cover. When we asked a museum employee about the photo, she said we could take it off the wall and examine it more closely. The numbers corresponded to names listed on the back of the photo. Only a handful of the boys were unidentified. It seemed too good to be true. We also found photos of Gialver's city bands from 1899 and 1902. Before dinner, we drove to Oakdale Cemetery. My Uncle Bob had visited the family graves there once, and I meant to get directions from him before the trip, but forgot. All I had were the block, lot, and grave numbers. Fortunately, I found a number for an off-duty caretaker, and he kindly gave me directions over the phone. Their graves looked like decorative stepping stones sunken into the lush green lawn. Gialver's included the phrase, pioneer Minnesota bandmaster. Eileen's said, loyal wife of Gialver Riggs, and a devoted mother, a useful musician. Useful musician struck me as odd. Why did he get to be a pioneer while she was merely useful? I was offended at first. I wondered if her husband and sons had chosen the phrase, or if she had. It was possible that, given her work ethic, being useful was a high compliment. I hoped she was happy with it. Since it was indeed written in stone, there was no way for me to know how she felt about it, and no changing it now. I shivered, despite the June heat, as I stood on the earth above their remains. I was as close to them physically as I would ever be. It seemed important to trace their names with my fingertips, to breathe in the evening air above them, and to listen to the chatter of birds in the nearby trees. It was all so peaceful. The two younger children were buried there too, Gialver Jr. and Rosalie. Standing next to my mom and dad, staring down at the small rectangular slabs of stone, I was reminded of another visit to a cemetery with my parents, nearly 40 years earlier, on a quiet road outside of Alexandria. I was 5 or 6, old enough to grasp that we were visiting my sister, and old enough to read the words etched into granite. Michelle Marie Riggs, August 4th, 1965, December 4th, 1965. I was much too young, however, to comprehend the weight of sorrow those words and dates represented, or to fully understand one of the first acronyms I ever learned, SIDS, or Sudden Infant Death Syndrome. That visit likely occurred over Memorial Day weekend. I learned later that my parents visited Michelle's grave every year at that time and left flowers. We didn't speak of Michelle often, but I would think about her when I'd glance at the photo of a baby girl who was not me that rested on my parents' dresser. I'd wonder what she and I would have done together, and what it would have felt like to have a living sister. I would always think of Michelle during Advent, when I helped my mom place 3 ceramic angels on the fireplace mantel. The boy in the blue robe with the trumpet was Pete. The girl in green, playing the violin, was Michelle. And the brown-haired girl in pink, singing, was me. Below the angels, Mom and I would hang the red felt Christmas stockings, decorated with glittering snowmen, candy canes, and other Christmas symbols. Michelle's would remain in the box, never to be filled, looking as new as the day it was made. My thoughts of Christmas and angels received a jolt when Dad, ever the gardener, crouched down and started gently pulling blades of grass that obscured the edges of the stones we were visiting. Rosalie died on Christmas Eve, and Eileen never again celebrated Christmas. But my parents didn't stop celebrating Christmas after Michelle's death. 2 years and 9 days later, I was born. Nuns at the hospital wrapped me in a giant red felt Christmas stocking. Its glittery silver letters proclaimed, "A star is born." When I was younger, I loved to hear my parents tell this story, and I'd ask them repeatedly to explain why they named me Joy. Because it was such a joy to have a girl, either my dad or my mom would say. It's what they left unsaid all those years that kicked me in the gut now, as I stood next to them and pictured my own 3 kids safe at home with my husband. How do you go on after tragedy? My parents could have divorced, they could have spiraled into depression, but somehow they kept loving each other and loving my brother and me. The next day, we stopped at the 2-story house where the Riggs family lived during most of their time in Crookston. Although it had suffered some neglect, it was a thrill to see it standing. I wondered how many bedrooms the house had, where the kids slept, where Eileen placed her piano. I wanted to peek inside, but I wasn't sure if anyone lived there. I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out. So instead, I had Dad pose with Big G, our cardboard cutout, in front of the house while I took pictures. Later that morning, we took a walking tour led by Kay Heggie, a historic preservation advocate I'd met through my blog. We took pictures of G. Oliver in front of the buildings that dated back to his time, and Kay showed us the parking lot where the Grand Opera House once stood. G. Oliver's early bands often performed there, and Sousa's band had played there twice. Unfortunately, a fire destroyed the building in the 1980s. The tour ended at the Crookston Times, where the city editor interviewed us about a research visit. She also took a photo of Dad and me holding Big G. It was possible that news coverage would help turn up new photos or sources of information. After lunch, we drove to Grand Forks and walked around the old part of town. The house where the Riggs family had lived no longer existed, and the block where it stood was all grass. A flood protection levee had been erected between it and the nearby Red River. We did find the sister Widman's location, however, and we discovered that North Dakota chippers tasted just as delicious. Next door to Widman's was the Metropolitan Theater building where the G. Oliver-led Grand Forks Band performed. A developer was turning it into condominiums. I failed to find any old band photos at the University of North Dakota Library or at the Grand Forks County Historical Society, which had a newer bandstand on its front lawn where the current Grand Forks City Band performed. Unfortunately, no one at the museum had information about the band's early history. As we headed out of town, I felt discouraged that we'd made no exciting discoveries in North Dakota. If it weren't for newspaper articles I uncovered before the trip, I never would have guessed that the Riggs family had lived in Grand Forks. But I shouldn't have been surprised. They were gone so quickly, they were like ghosts that weren't invested enough in the place to linger. Happy birthday, book! Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.